The moment. You're standing at the edge of a field. It's early morning, that specific kind of quiet where the air feels like it hasn't decided what kind of day it wants to be yet. And in the middle of that field, there's a crow. It's standing next to another crow, a dead one, and it's just standing there, not eating it, not flying away, just standing, watching. And then, one by one, other crows start landing around it. They don't make a sound. They form a loose ring. They stay for about 10 minutes, and then they all leave together. You just watched a crow funeral. Or did you? That's the question that has quietly driven researchers absolutely mad for the better part of 3 decades. Because on one hand, you have animals doing things that look, sound, and feel exactly like grief. Like ritual. Like the kind of behavior we'd immediately recognize in ourselves. And on the other hand, you have a very inconvenient problem. We have no idea what's actually happening inside their heads. So here's the question, a deceptively simple one. Do animals understand death? Short answer, some of them, possibly, in ways that should make you deeply uncomfortable about how special you thought you were. Long answer, that's what this is about. Let's start with what understanding death even means, because it turns out that's already a rabbit hole. When researchers talk about death comprehension, they don't just mean knows that dead things are dead. That's the floor. A dog knows a dead squirrel isn't going anywhere. That's not understanding death. That's just reading stillness. Full death comprehension, according to cognitive ethologist Gordon Burghardt and a landmark 2011 review by Susanna Monceau and colleagues, actually breaks down into at least 5 distinct concepts. Non-functionality, understanding that a dead body no longer does anything. Irreversibility, grasping that dead is permanent, not temporary. Universality, knowing that death applies to all living things, including yourself. Unpredictability, recognizing that death can come at any time, for any reason. And causality, understanding what causes death. Humans, developmentally, don't fully assemble all 5 of these until around age 7. Let that settle for a second. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Different animals seem to hit different rungs on this ladder. Some appear to grasp non-functionality clearly. A few seem to get irreversibility in a murky behavioral sense. Almost none, except possibly 1 or 2 species, show strong evidence of universality or self-mortality awareness. And that gap, that staircase of comprehension, is exactly what makes this question so strange and so humbling. Because the question isn't binary. It isn't, yes, they understand, or no, they don't. It's more like asking how far up the stairs they've climbed. And some of them have climbed further than you'd expect. Let's talk about elephants, because if you're going to talk about animal grief, you have to talk about elephants, and not in a vague, feel-good way, but in a way that's going to leave you slightly unsettled. Cynthia Moss spent over 40 years studying elephant behavior in Amboseli National Park in Kenya. What she documented, and what has since been replicated by Joyce Poole and others, is a pattern of behavior around death that defies easy dismissal. When an elephant dies, other elephants don't just leave, they return. Sometimes days later, sometimes months later. They revisit the bones. They touch the skull with their trunks, specifically the skull and the tusks, not other parts of the skeleton. In one documented case, a female elephant carried her dead calf for 3 days before finally leaving it. She wasn't confused. She'd been eating, drinking, doing normal elephant things. She just kept coming back to the body and lifting it, standing over it, using her trunk to nudge it. 3 days. Let that sit with you. Now, there's a hard-nosed skeptical argument here, and it's a fair one. We don't know what she was experiencing internally. We're projecting. The behavior might be explained by smell, by familiar chemical signatures, by a disruption in the normal social signals that living elephants emit. The absence of those signals might create a kind of behavioral loop, a compulsion to investigate, not grief in any meaningful emotional sense. Fine. But here's the counter-problem. Elephants have also been documented responding differently to the remains of elephants versus the remains of other species. In a 2006 study by Karen McComb and colleagues at the University of Sussex, elephants were presented with skulls from elephants, buffalo, and rhinos, all roughly the same size, all equally novel. The elephants spent significantly more time investigating the elephant skulls. They used their feet and trunks more. They showed more sustained interest. They recognized their own dead as categorically different from other dead. That is not a simple smell response. That is something more. We don't have a clean word for it, but it's something more. Back to those crows. Kaeli Swift, a researcher at the University of Washington, spent years doing something gloriously weird for science. She had people wear rubber masks, then carry dead crows into areas where wild crow communities lived, and then she watched what happened. The crows went absolutely ballistic. They mobbed the masked person. They alarm called. They recruited other crows. They remembered the face, or rather the mask, for weeks. And here's the part that matters. They also gathered around the dead crow. They performed what looked like group investigation rituals. They would stop feeding in that area for days afterward. The dead crow functioned, behaviorally, like a warning beacon, and the gathering, the ring of crows we talked about at the start, seems to serve, at least in part, as a rapid information-sharing event about danger. Which sounds almost disappointingly functional. Oh, it's just survival strategy, not grief at all. Except Swift's own conclusion is more careful than that. She points out that what we're seeing in crows is probably not grief in the way you and I experience it, but it's also not nothing. There's clearly an association being formed between death and danger. There's clearly some recognition that this individual, this specific crow, is now different, now absent from the social fabric in a way that matters. Whether that constitutes understanding death or merely responding adaptively to its signals is a line that may not exist as cleanly as we'd like. The crow doesn't know it will die, but it knows that crow is gone, and it acts accordingly. The chimpanzee problem. Now we get to the ones that really keep researchers up at night. In 2008, a chimpanzee named Pansy died at Blair Drummond Safari Park in Scotland. She was old. Her death was slow and visible to her group. And what happened in the hours before and after was filmed and later analyzed in a paper published in Current Biology. Her daughter groomed her compulsively in the final hours, far more than was typical. Other group members touched her face, her hands, tested for breath by putting fingers near her mouth. After she died, her daughter stayed with the body overnight. The males in the group became unusually aggressive for days afterward. They kept going back to her empty sleeping spot, looking around, sitting. One of the other females cleaned the body. She removed debris from Pansy's fur, methodically, long after there was any social benefit to doing so. In Bossou, Guinea, 2 chimpanzee mothers were observed carrying the mummified bodies of their dead infants for weeks. Researchers noted the mothers occasionally lay the small bodies on the ground, then pick them up again, almost like checking, like reconfirming, like the mind doing something with information it doesn't know how to store. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. Chimpanzees show behavioral changes following the death of group members that are consistent with what we'd call a grief response in humans. Disrupted sleep, loss of appetite, social withdrawal, repeated return to the death site. They also appear to recognize that the dead individual is no longer going to respond. There's a shift in how they interact with the body over time, from social engagement toward something quieter, more tentative. What we cannot say, and this is the honest part, is whether any of this involves a conscious concept of death as a phenomenon, whether the chimpanzee understands that death is coming for her too. But she knows something changed, permanently, and she doesn't know what to do with that. That's not nothing. Here's the uncomfortable escalation. For an animal to truly understand death, to grasp universality and self-mortality, it probably needs something like self-awareness. The capacity to understand that there is a me that can cease. And self-awareness in animals is measured, however imperfectly, by one famously strange test, the mirror test. Pass the mirror test. Recognize that the reflection is you, not another animal, and you've demonstrated at least a rudimentary model of self. The species that have reliably passed include great apes, bottlenose dolphins, orcas, Asian elephants, European magpies, and possibly manta rays. Notice anything? These are also the species with the most robust grief-like behaviors. The overlap is not a coincidence. It's a data point. Now here's the cliff edge of this idea. If you have self-awareness, even a dim, flickering version of it, does that mean you have some concept of your own ending? Psychologist Jesse Baring argued in his 2011 book The Belief Instinct that the inability to mentally simulate one's own non-existence is actually what drives human religion, afterlife belief, the whole architecture of how we handle the terror of death. We can't imagine not existing, so we imagine existing differently, somewhere else, in another form. What if some animals are sitting on that same precipice, not with language, not with theology, but with the raw, wordless experience of knowing that individuals disappear, that the social world can be suddenly and permanently altered, and that something, some vague turbulence in the processing, attaches to that knowledge? We don't know. We genuinely don't know. But a dolphin has been observed supporting a dead calf at the surface of the water, keeping it afloat for days. There is no functional explanation for that. There is no survival benefit. There is only something that looks, from where we stand, like refusal. Like the body doing what the mind can't accept. What death does to the living. Here's the thing that researchers keep coming back to. The thread that runs under all of this. The most interesting question might not be whether animals understand death conceptually, but what death does to them emotionally and socially. Because even if a chimpanzee or an elephant or a crow doesn't have a philosophical model of mortality, even if they can't articulate or even consciously think the thought, "I too will one day die," they still have to navigate the social aftermath of losing individuals who mattered to them. And the evidence for genuine social grief, as opposed to conceptual death awareness, is actually quite strong. A 2016 study of wild baboons in Botswana by researchers at Duke University found that baboons who lost close social partners showed measurable increases in glucocorticoids, stress hormones, for weeks after the death. They also showed behavioral loneliness indicators, more time alone, more nervous self-grooming, fewer social interactions. The ones with strong remaining social networks recovered faster. The ones without them didn't. That is a grief arc. That is what grief looks like in humans too. The biochemical signature, the behavioral withdrawal, the role of social support in recovery. It's the same shape. We use different words for it. We build elaborate rituals and theology around it. But the underlying shape of what death does to a social animal is strikingly, uncomfortably consistent across species. Your grief and a baboon's grief are not identical, but they might share a common root, deep in the evolutionary past, when losing a group member was also a survival problem, and the social brain needed a system for processing that loss. Grief might not be a uniquely human response to a uniquely human understanding of death. Grief might be something evolution invented long before we arrived, for animals who needed to reckon with absence, who needed to remap their social world around a whole. We just gave it a name. There's one more rung on that ladder worth talking about: unpredictability. The understanding that death can come for any individual, at any time, for no predictable reason. This is arguably the most destabilizing aspect of death cognition. It's the one that, in humans, generates the most anxiety, the most religious and philosophical infrastructure, the most behavioral overcompensation. We build entire civilizations partly to manage the psychological weight of knowing that any moment could be the last one. Do animals experience this? There's a fascinating thread of research on what's called death anxiety in non-human primates. Chimpanzees have been observed reacting not just to known individuals dying, but to the sight of unknown dead animals in ways that trigger prolonged stress responses and altered group behavior. The sight of death, even unfamiliar death, registers as something significant, something that reorganizes attention and elevates arousal in ways that go beyond simple predator response. Whether that constitutes death anxiety in the full existential sense, the human-style dread of annihilation, is genuinely impossible to know. We can't get inside the chimpanzee's head. We can't ask it. But we can note that the physiological and behavioral fingerprints of what we'd call unease around death appear across a much wider range of species than we once assumed. The octopus, you might be relieved to hear, shows no recorded evidence of any of this. The octopus does not appear to have a grief response, a funeral behavior, or existential dread. The octopus is, in this specific way, doing better than all of us. Here's the gentle existential vertigo part. Stay with it. If grief is older than language, If death recognition exists in animals who never read a philosophy book, never built a tomb, never sat around a campfire trying to explain where the dead go, then what does that say about what those behaviors mean in us? It doesn't diminish them. If anything, it deepens them. The fact that a mother elephant returns to the bones of her child days later isn't less moving because we can trace it to evolutionary social bonding. It's more moving. It means that the impulse to return, to acknowledge, to not simply walk away from what was loved, that impulse is not a cultural invention. It is not something we made up to cope. It is written into the structure of social brains that care about individuals. You were built to grieve, so were they. The architecture is old. It was useful before it was sacred. And maybe that's the most honest answer to the question. Do animals understand death? Not the way you do. Not with language and religion and the full philosophical horror of self-mortality. But some of them stand at the edge of it. Some of them feel the shape of the hole left by an individual they will never see again. Some of them carry the body 3 days before they can leave it. That's not nothing. That's a lot, actually. The sign-off. So the next time you see a nature documentary and an elephant touches the bones of a dead relative, or a crow stands in silence at the edge of a road, don't be too quick to call it instinct and move on. The line between instinct and grief, it turns out, is thinner than we thought, and it was always going to be. Because grief, at its most stripped down, most animal level, is just love with nowhere left to go. And that is old. That is much, much older than us. Here's the question I want you to leave with, and honestly, drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one. If you could know, truly know, the inner experience of one grieving animal, which species would you choose, and what do you think you'd find? I'll see you in the next one.